My name is Angela Brooks. I am 42 years old. I was sitting in my sister's kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in March when she said it, and I remember thinking that the coffee mug in my hands was too hot and that I should put it down. And instead, I just sat there holding it and let her words settle over me the way all of Claire's words settled over me, like ash after something has already burned down. She looked at me across her kitchen island, the one with the marble top she'd redone 2 summers ago, and she said, Angela, you have spent your entire adult life hiding behind a camera, and you don't even know what you've been hiding from. And then she turned back to the sink and went on rinsing the dishes, and my phone rang. The caller was a man named James Whitfield. He said he was a defense attorney practicing out of Virginia Beach and that he had been trying to find me for 6 weeks. He said he had a client, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, United States Marine Corps, and that Staff Sergeant Webb was facing 18 years in a federal military prison for dereliction of duty and for misbehavior before the enemy, specifically for abandoning his post during an active engagement in which 3 of his fellow Marines were wounded and 1 was killed. He said there was one photograph that he believed could change. He said the photographer's credit on that photograph was mine. He said, Miss Brooks, I need to know if you still have the original image file, unedited, with all the metadata intact. Claire was still rinsing dishes. She did not know what was happening 3 feet away from her. She did not know that the camera she had spent 20 years calling a hiding place had just become the only thing standing between a man and the next 18 years of his life. I told James Whitfield I would call him back. I set my phone on the table. Claire turned off the faucet and looked at me the way she looked when she was trying to decide whether to ask a question. I said it was nobody, just work. She nodded and went back to wiping the counter, and I sat there with my too-hot mug and thought about October in Helmand Province and a photograph I had taken on a reflex in the middle of the worst day of a very difficult 3 weeks, and I thought about what it meant that it had found its way back to me like this. 4.5 years later, in my sister's kitchen, on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Let me tell you what it means to be a combat photographer. Not the version that sounds clean, the one where you describe the professional obligation and the historical record and the tradition of bearing witness. The real version. The version that you think about at 4 a.m. when you're between embeds and there's nothing but the ceiling and the dark. It means you go to the places where people are trying to kill each other and you stay. Staying is the whole job. Staying when the part of your brain that developed over 4 million years of human evolution is screaming at you to get low and get out. Staying because you have made a decision before you ever arrived in that particular place that the record matters more than your comfort, and you have been rigorous enough with yourself to understand what you mean by the word record and what you mean by the word matters. You do not go for the adrenaline, or you do not last more than a year or 2 if you do, because the adrenaline runs out and what's left is the work, the weight of the work, the specific gravity of carrying images of things that most human beings will never see, and that most human beings need to see, even if they don't know they need to. I had been doing this for 14 years when James Whitfield called me. I started at 28, which in this profession is considered late, though I did not know that at the time. Before that, I shot weddings and corporate events and once spent 8 months photographing upscale homes for a real estate developer, which was technically sophisticated work that paid well and which I remember as one of the most deadening experiences of my professional life. I was good with light. I was good with framing. I understood what made an image work. What I could not figure out was what I was supposed to do with that, selling houses. I had always known, in the abstract, that documentary photography existed. I had seen it in magazines and online. I had a mild appreciation for it the way you have a mild appreciation for most things that haven't yet taken hold of you. The thing that changed that happened in a gallery in Chicago when I was 27, a retrospective of images from various conflict zones over the preceding 20 years. I walked in, not expecting much, and I walked out 2 hours later, changed in a way that I didn't know how to explain to anyone, including myself, for a long time. The images were not dramatic in the way that news images can be dramatic, all shock and immediate recoil. They were patient. They were the kind of images that required something from you, that asked you to stand in front of them and be willing to receive what they had to give. There was one image in particular, I don't remember the photographer's name or the conflict it was taken in, of an old man sitting in the rubble of what had been a building, holding a photograph of a younger man in a frame, and the glass of the frame was cracked, and the old man was not looking at the camera, he was looking at the photograph. And on his face was an expression that I did not have the vocabulary for at 27, but that I have since come to understand as the specific kind of grief that belongs to people who have outlived what they built. I stood in front of that image for 20 minutes. I walked out of the gallery and I called a magazine and said I wanted to embed with a military unit as a documentary photographer. They were patient and somewhat baffled and asked several reasonable questions about my qualifications. I answered all of them honestly. I took the training courses they recommended, one in wilderness first aid and one in hostile environments, the second of which involved simulations that were uncomfortable enough to make me seriously reconsider whether I was cut out for any of this, and then I decided I was. And I went. My first embed was in Helmand Province in 2011. I was 28 years old. I weighed 134 pounds with my body armor on, which is relevant because I was carrying 40 pounds of gear and the math made itself felt by the end of the first day. My left ear had full hearing. My forearm had no scar. I did not know yet how much the work was going to cost me. Not in the dramatic way, but in the accumulated way. The way that you pay for things in installments over years and don't notice the balance until you look at it all at once. My sister Claire was 31 when I told her I was going. We were at our mother's house for a Sunday dinner. Claire had 2 kids by then, 3 and 5 years old, and she was running the outreach department of a nonprofit that worked with at-risk youth. And she had a husband who coached high school football and who was, and still is, one of the genuinely good people I have encountered in my life. Claire's life was rooted intentionally, specifically rooted. She had made deliberate choices to be close to things, to family, to a city, to the ongoing ordinary texture of a life built somewhere. I think, looking back, that my announcement was harder on her than it looked. I think she understood, the moment I said it, that I was going in a direction she could not follow and could not entirely understand. She said, "Okay." She said it with her face very still, and then she said, "How long is the first one?" I said, "I didn't know exactly." She said, "Will you call Mom?" I said, "I would call Mom." She said, "Okay." And she went to check on the kids. That was the last time the subject of my career passed between us without the camera word. The camera word arrived incrementally. It started out as concern, which was fair. The first 3 years, what Claire said was mostly versions of, "I worry about you," or "I don't understand how you do it," or "Doesn't it bother you?" These were honest questions, and I tried to answer them honestly, which is harder than it sounds because the honest answer to "Doesn't it bother you?" is yes, everything about it bothers me. And that is precisely why I keep going. And that answer does not make anyone feel better. Somewhere in the 4th year, the concern shifted. I don't know when exactly or what triggered it. Maybe it was a particular assignment she had read about. Maybe it was something our mother said. What I noticed was that the questions started to contain their own answers. She stopped asking how I did it and started saying things like, "I just don't understand how you can stand there with a camera while people are suffering." And there's something that bothers me about the distance. And at some point, don't you want to actually do something? By the 7th year, she had arrived at the camera word in its clearest form. We were at her house for Christmas, and I had taken some photographs at the dinner table, and she had looked at me from across the table and said, "You could just put the camera down and be here." I said I was here. She said, "Angela, you are always behind the camera." I put the camera down and ate my dinner, and we did not talk about it again that night. Over the years, she found different configurations for the same idea. You hide behind it. You use it to put distance between yourself and real life. You've been hiding behind it since you were 28. You spend more time documenting life than living it. Each version cuts slightly differently. The way a wound shifts its location but keeps the same source. I developed a practice response, which was no response. I held my mug. I changed the subject. I asked about her kids, who were genuinely interesting kids. Her son Daniel, who had gotten serious about astronomy, and her daughter Jessie, who was doing competitive debate and was, by Claire's reports, extremely difficult to argue with. What I did not say to Claire over 14 years was the thing I should have said. What I did not say was that the camera is not a wall. The camera is not the distance between me and what is happening. The camera is the reason I am there, and the instrument of why being there means anything. And when I raise it, I am not removing myself from the situation. I am doing the only thing that can preserve the situation for the people who are not in it and who will need to understand it later. I did not say any of this to Claire because, by the time I understood it clearly enough to say it, we had established such a well-worn groove in this particular disagreement that stepping out of it felt like too much to ask of either of us. The second part of what she said in her kitchen on that Tuesday in March was the part I had not heard before. Not just hiding behind the camera, but you don't even know what you've been hiding from. I held my mug, I let it sit, and then my phone rang. I drove home from Claire's and I sat in my truck in the parking garage for 11 minutes. Not because I was deciding whether to call James Whitfield back. I already knew I was going to call him back. I was sitting there because I needed 11 minutes to let the weight of what he'd told me settle into my body before I had to do anything useful with it. There is a technique I learned in my third year of this work, a kind of deliberate pause between receiving difficult information and acting on it that functions as a pressure valve. You sit, you let the thing be real, then you move. What I was letting be real was Marcus Webb. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, 11 years in the United States Marine Corps, facing 18 years in federal prison for something I had a photograph of him not doing. I called James Whitfield from my truck. He answered on the second ring. He said, "Miss Brooks, thank you for calling back." I said, "Tell me everything." And he did. It took 40 minutes. I sat in my truck with my right ear against the phone because my left ear with the hearing aid was giving me static in that particular parking structure. The acoustics were wrong, and I let him tell me the whole shape of the case. Marcus Webb had been charged under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, specifically Articles 87 and 99, dereliction of duty and misbehavior before the enemy. The core allegation was that during an active firefight on October 12, 2019, in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, Webb had left his assigned position in the engagement line and moved away from the direction of the threat, and that this absence had contributed to conditions in which 3 of his fellow Marines were wounded, 1 fatally. The primary witness against him was a lance corporal named Trent Ballard, who had been positioned approximately 20 meters from Webb's assigned post, and who had testified in the preliminary hearing that he observed Webb moving away from the line, and that when he called out to Webb, Webb did not respond. Without Ballard, Whitfield told me, the government's case was technically arguable, but practically thin. The unit's own after-action documentation was incomplete, as it often is in the immediate aftermath of a complex engagement, and the other witnesses' accounts were fractured by the chaos and the grief that followed. With Ballard, the prosecution had a named eyewitness to what looked, in Ballard's telling, like a Marine who broke under fire. And the Marine Corps takes breaking under fire with a seriousness that I understood and respected, even as I listened to what Whitfield was telling me Webb had actually been doing. Whitfield said he had spent the first 8 months of his representation of Webb doing what he always did with cases like this, which was to find out who had been there, not just who was in the unit. Who was there with a camera? He said embedded journalists were often the most thorough photographic record of a given engagement because the military's own documentation was uneven, and because a professional photographer with a professional camera and professional discipline for metadata produced a more reliable evidentiary record than almost anything else available. He had cross-referenced the unit, the date, and the location with every accreditation record from every credentialed news organization that had placed embedded journalists in Helmand Province in October of 2019. He found 3. 2 of them had not been in the specific area on October 12th. The third was me. He found a photograph with my credit in the battalion's public affairs archive, not the image he was looking for, but confirmation that I had been present. He searched the archive of the magazine I worked for and found, in a folder of unpublished images from the issue that ran in December of 2019, an image designated only by its file number but identifiable by the timestamp and the composition as having been taken during the engagement on October 12th. The image showed Marcus Webb in the open, outside his assigned position, carrying a child. Whitfield said, the file metadata, if it's intact and verifiable, places the timestamp at 14, 17, and 52 seconds. Ballard testified he saw Webb moving away from his post at approximately 14:15. Your photograph, Miss Brooks, if the file is what it appears to be, shows Webb not moving away from the engagement 2 minutes after Ballard's observation. It shows him moving toward a burning civilian vehicle, with a child in his arms. While Small Arms fire was still active in the area, he was not abandoning his post. He was doing something else entirely. I said, I know. I knew what was in the photograph when I took it. There was a silence. Whitfield said, You've seen this image before. I said, I took it. I processed the whole set from that day. I saw it that evening in the operations tent. He said, And you knew what it showed. I said, I knew it showed Webb outside his post carrying a child. I didn't know there was going to be a court-martial. I didn't know anyone was going to say he abandoned his position. I filed my images and moved on to the next assignment. He said, Ms. Brooks, I need to ask you to come to Virginia Beach and testify. I need the original image file with all metadata intact. I need you to authenticate the photograph and testify to the conditions under which it was taken and to the chain of custody of the file. The prosecution will challenge it. They'll look at the timestamp verification, the file integrity, your credibility as a witness. Are you willing to do this? I said I was. I was not entirely sure I was, but I said it. I called Deb that night at 9 o'clock her time in New York, which meant she was still at her desk, because Deb was always still at her desk at 9 o'clock in the evening, a habit her husband described as a mild medical condition and her doctor described as unsustainable, and both of them had been saying these things for years without any discernible effect on her schedule. She answered on the second ring and said, What happened? Because that is how Deb answers a call that comes at 9 in the evening. She presupposes something has happened. I said, the Helmand embed, October 2019. The Webb image. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, from October 19. Yes. The image of Webb pulling the civilians. I said, you named it that. She said, I named all images with an identifiable primary subject, the Webb image. What about it? I told her everything Whitfield had told me. She listened without interrupting, which was typical, because Deb did not interrupt when she was actually listening, only when she had already formulated her response, and this was information she had not anticipated. She said, he's in prison. I said, he's been charged. Trial in 11 weeks. She said, Angela. I said, I know. She said, the file is in the archive. I can have the full resolution original with complete metadata pulled and secured tonight. Do you need that? I said, yes. Can you do it? She said, I can do it in 20 minutes. Can I say something first? I said, yes. She said, you need to go into that courtroom settled about what your work is and what it's worth. Because when you sit in that witness chair and you put that photograph in front of a judge and a jury panel, you are making a statement, not just about Webb, about what you've been doing for 14 years and why it matters. And if you go in there uncertain about that, the prosecutor is going to find the uncertainty and take it apart. So I need to know that, why you were there. I said, Deb. She said, do you know why you were there? I said, I'm going to call you later in the week. She said, the file will be in your encrypted share folder by 10. The image was there when I checked. I opened it and I looked at it for a long time. Image 1, 43, October 12th, 2019, 14:17 and 52 seconds local time. Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Camera, Canon, EOS 1, DX, Mark II. 70 to 200 millimeter telephoto at 160 millimeters, aperture 5.6, shutter 1/800th of a second, ISO 640. I know these settings the way a musician knows the key of a song they've played 100 times, automatically. The technical information living in the hands before it lives in the mind. In the image, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb is in the open. He is approximately 60 meters forward of his assigned position. He is moving from right to left across the frame with a child who appears to be no more than 4 or 5 years old held against his left side, the child's arms around his neck. Behind Webb and to his right, leaning against his back and moving under her own power, is a woman in a dark headscarf. her left arm wrapped around his torso, his right hand reaching back to grip her elbow. Behind the woman, roughly 8 meters back, a white pickup truck, civilian, of the kind common across the region, burns with the specific intensity of a vehicle fire that has been going for less than 2 minutes, the flames still high and energetic before the collapse. In the background, beyond the vehicle and to the right, you can see the smoke column from the IED detonation. It is still dark and vertical, meaning the detonation had occurred within the previous 60 to 90 seconds when my shutter pressed. The engagement was ongoing. Small arms fire was active, and Marcus Webb was 60 meters outside his assigned position because there was a child in a burning vehicle. I had looked at this image on the evening of October 12, 2019, for perhaps 4 minutes. I had registered it as a strong image. I had noted it for consideration, and then I had kept moving through the other 216 images from that day, because that is the job. You keep moving. You do not linger, because lingering costs time, and time costs the work. Now, I looked at it for 40 minutes. I looked at it the way you look at something when you understand what it means in a way you didn't understand before. The image hadn't changed. What had changed was the weight of the information attached to it. Marcus Webb, 34 years old at the time of this photograph, from Macon, Georgia, 11 years in the United States Marine Corps at the time of this embed. He had a daughter named Priya who had been 6 years old in October of 2019, which meant she was 10 years old now, which meant she had been watching her father move toward a court-martial for a significant portion of her conscious life, which meant she understood things that no 10-year-old should have to understand about the gap between what a person does and what they're accused of doing. I had met Marcus Webb on the second day of my embed with Charlie Company. He was not the largest personality in the unit, which in a group of Marines is a meaningful distinction, because the range of personality in a Marine infantry unit is genuinely wide, and the largest ones fill a room in ways that are hard to ignore. Webb was not that. He was the one who checked the equipment. He was the one who knew everyone's mother's name and their hometown and what they were planning to do when they got out. He was the one who sat down with the new arrivals on their first evening and talked them through what to expect in a voice that was honest without being theatrical about it. He showed me the photograph of Priya on the second day. She was wearing a pink dress and standing in front of a birthday cake with 6 candles, and her grin was the kind of grin that is not yet self-conscious, the kind that belongs entirely to a child who hasn't yet learned that grins can be evaluated by other people. He kept it in a plastic sleeve inside his left breast pocket. He showed it to me the way soldiers always showed me, pictures of their families, because I was outside the chain of command and because there was something about the way I held a camera that said, I am here to see what is actually here, not what is supposed to be here. I photographed Webb 3 times before October 12th. Once during a vehicle patrol, his profile against the morning mountains, the light doing something remarkable with the dust in the air. Once during a briefing, his face in that Marine stillness that is not blankness but concentrated readiness, something coiled and available behind the eyes. And once sitting outside the wire the hour before a mission, eating crackers from a foil packet with his knife because he'd lost his spoon. And he looked up and saw the camera and held one cracker up like a toast and said, "Luxury dining, Miss Brooks. The Marine Corps spares no expense." I liked him. I liked the economy of him, the way he didn't perform anything. A lot of what you encounter in an embed is performance, not dishonestly, but because people know they're being documented and the knowledge changes them. Webb was one of those rare people who didn't change. What you saw was what was there. I had no reason to expect that would matter later. October 12th, 2019. I do not reconstruct that day in sequence. I reconstruct it in physical sensation. The way the body stores things, it was not prepared to file any other way. The heat, which by October in Helmand should have started to ease but had not eased that week, pressing down from a white sky with an indifference that felt almost deliberate. The weight of the body armor that I had stopped noticing after 2 weeks and noticed again whenever we moved in a hurry. The diesel smell that was always present near any military staging area, that particular combination of fuel and dry earth and something underneath it both, something mineral and specific to that ground. The sound of the IED is not something I can describe in a way that does justice to what it actually is. I know what a detonation sounds like from a distance. This was not that. This was the thing that arrives before the sound arrives. The pressure wave that hits the body first, and then the sound comes. And by the time the sound comes, your body has already made its decisions. My right knee hit the ground. The camera swung against my chest on its strap. My hand found the camera before my brain had consciously issued the instruction. This is what 14 years does to you. The body knows. The shutter pressed. I did not decide to press the shutter. The camera was there and my hand was there, and my eye went to the viewfinder and the shutter pressed. It is the same way that a surgeon's hand moves to a particular tool before the conscious mind has fully processed the visual field. The training and the repetition have built something faster and more direct than a deliberate choice, a kind of professional reflex that bypasses the slower systems. The camera goes up, the eye goes in, the shutter presses. The left ear went at the same moment, or close enough to the same moment, that I have never been entirely certain of the sequence. The blast wave and the shutter press were effectively simultaneous. What I knew, in the seconds after, was that my left ear had a ringing in it that was different from normal ringing, different in quality and depth, and that it was not going away. The medic who looked at me in the first hour after told me it might resolve. It did not resolve. 30% of what I had in that ear before October 12th came back. The rest did not. The hearing aid I wear now is a good one, the kind you can barely see. In quiet rooms and moderate environments, it compensates almost completely, and most people don't notice. In difficult acoustic environments, airports, restaurants with hard surfaces, parking structures with particular echo patterns, it works less well, and I miss things. I have learned to turn my right side toward whoever I most need to hear. I have learned that pardon, and I'm sorry, could you repeat that, are phrases that pass without comment if you use them consistently and without visible distress. The scar on my left forearm, a pale line approximately 4 centimeters long on the inside of the arm, came from a fragment of the IED casing that the medic retrieved in the first hour. Less than a centimeter in length, he said. He said I had been very fortunate. I agreed with him. The scar is not dramatic. I see it every time I raise the camera, which is to say several hundred times a day. Over time, it has become simply part of the arm the camera is attached to. I looked at image 143 for 40 minutes on that March evening, and then I called Whitfield and confirmed my participation. The weeks that followed were strange in the specific way that things are strange when you have committed to something significant and the actual event is still weeks away. The strangeness is not anxiety, exactly. Though anxiety is part of it, it is more like a persistent, low-frequency awareness that everything you are doing in the ordinary foreground of your life is happening against the background of the thing that is coming. I edited images from a wildfire recovery feature I had done in New Mexico. I answered emails. I drove to the grocery store and bought too much coffee. And in the background, always, Marcus Webb. Deb checked in every few days. She would call in the morning and say, "How are you?" And I would say, "Fine." And she would say, "Are you sleeping?" And I would say, "Yes." And she would say, "Angela." And I would say, "I'm fine, Deb." And then we would talk about the actual business we needed to talk about. And at the end, she would say, "Call me if you need anything." And I would say, "I would," and I would if there was something specific. Deb had been my photo editor for 15 years and my friend for almost as long. She was 56 and gruff in the specific way that certain people from New York develop a kind of gruffness that functions as warmth for those who know how to read it. She had no patience for complaining and enormous patience for listening, which sounds contradictory, but in practice is one of the most effective combinations in a person. She sent care packages when I was embedded, the same package every time. Good coffee, because she knew I bought cheap coffee for myself and considered this a correctable character flaw. Chocolate not in individual wrappers, because the sound of crinkling wrappers in a confined space can break a person. A small spiral notebook, even though she knew I used my phone for notes because she said handwriting things was different and she was not wrong. And always one postcard with a photograph on it, chosen specifically for me, always something she thought I needed to see or remember or be reminded of. I had 12 of those postcards over 15 years. I kept them all. They were on the wall of every room I'd lived in, arranged in the order she'd sent them, which meant in the order they had arrived in my life when I most needed whatever they were carrying. The postcard I was thinking about in the weeks before the trial was the first one. the one she had sent during my first embed in Kandahar in 2011. It was a reproduction of a photograph by the Brazilian photographer Sebastião Salgado, taken at the Serra Pelada gold mine in Brazil in the early 1980s. The image shows a narrow path cut into an earthen slope that is crowded with hundreds of men on ladders, all of them moving bags of dirt upward in what appears to be an essentially infinite repetition of the same motion. In the foreground of the image, one man on one ladder is looking directly into the camera. He is not paused. He is not performing awareness of the camera. He is simply looking in the middle of his work, and what his face carries is not suffering and not endurance and not any simple thing you could label. It is the face of a person being exactly where he is and doing exactly what he is doing and existing in that, and someone standing across from him and saying, "I see you." The handwritten note on the back of the postcard said, in Deb's handwriting, that tilted slightly forward as if it was in a hurry, "This is why you go." I had understood that postcard at 28 in a certain way. I understood it differently now. The photograph does not save the man on the ladder from the mine or the weight or the conditions. What the photograph does is say he was there. He was real. He stood on that ladder and he looked up and someone was there to see it. And the seeing was preserved. And the preservation is the thing that the future has access to that it would not have had otherwise. Not rescue. Not intervention. Record. True record. Image 143 does not save Marcus Webb from the firefight or from the court-martial or from the 9 months of accumulating dread before a verdict. What it does is say he was there and what he was doing when he was there, and that the record of what he was doing is more precise and more durable than the memory of a 24-year-old Lance Corporal who was in the middle of the worst hour of his life and who, under those conditions, made an assumption about what he saw and carried the assumption into a courtroom because the assumption was what he believed. Memory bends. It bends toward what we needed to be true at the time, toward what made sense of the chaos, toward the story that let us move forward. This is not dishonesty. This is how human memory actually works, and it is one of the reasons that documentary photography exists as a profession, because the photograph bends less. The photograph holds the moment as it was, not as anyone needed it to be. I was thinking about all of this in the weeks before the trial, and I was not saying any of it out loud to anyone, because there was not anyone in my immediate daily life who I could say it to without it requiring more explanation than I had the energy to provide. I said some of it to Deb in pieces in the calls we had every few days, and she would listen and occasionally say, "Yeah," or "Right," in the way she had of confirming without editorializing. I was also thinking about what Claire had said, the part I had not heard before. "You don't even know what you've been hiding from." I had turned this over in my mind for 3 days before I called Whitfield back to confirm. And then in the weeks after confirmation, I continued to turn it over, not obsessively, more the way you turn something over when you know the answer is in there somewhere and you haven't found the angle yet. Claire's version of my career was not a malicious version. That was what made it complicated. It was not cruelty. It was concern that had, over the years, calcified into a conclusion. She had looked at the shape of my choices, the leaving, the embedding, the returning only to leave again, the camera always present, and she had drawn an inference about what all of that meant about my interior life. She thought I was running from something. She thought the camera was the method of running. The thing I could not say to Claire, and that I was beginning to understand I needed to say before this was over, was that the camera is not how you run from things. The camera is how you go toward them. The camera is the instrument by which you get close to the things that are hardest to be close to and stay there long enough to make them real for people who can't be there themselves. There is nothing about holding a camera in a firefight that is distance. There is nothing about pressing the shutter on the worst moment of the worst day and then carrying that image back with you that is hiding. Hiding is not what I have done. Staying is what I have done. For 14 years and in more places than I can count, and at a cost I don't talk about because talking about the cost sounds like complaint. Staying is what I have done. But I hadn't said it to her, and she didn't know. Whitfield arranged preparation sessions over the weeks before the trial. We worked through the authentication of the image, the technical documentation of the camera's timestamp synchronization, the chain of custody of the file from the camera card to my laptop, to Deb's archive, to the defense's digital forensics firm. He walked me through the probable lines of the prosecution's cross-examination, the challenges to the timestamp, the questions about file integrity, the potential attacks on my credibility as a witness. He was meticulous and calm. He spoke in the precise, economical way of someone who had spent 20 years understanding that precision in language was the difference between a jury understanding something and a jury almost understanding something. In the third preparation call, he asked me if I wanted to speak with Marcus Webb directly. He said it was entirely up to me, that Webb had made the request, but that there was no obligation. I said yes. Webb called me on a Wednesday evening in the 6th week before the trial. His voice was quieter than I remembered it, though I had not heard it in 4.5 years, and what I remembered was the voice in a very different context. The staging area, and the forward operating base, and the particular acoustics of a briefing tent. This voice was sitting in a room somewhere and doing its best to sound steady. He said, "Miss Brooks, first, I want to thank you for the work you did out there. Not specifically the October photograph, for being there in the first place. I remember you. I remember seeing you in the staging area on the morning of October 12th and thinking, she's still here." Some of the embedded journalists rotated out every 2 weeks. You'd been with us for 3 weeks at that point. I said, I was there to complete the embed. He said, I know. I'm just saying I noticed that you were still there. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, when Whitfield showed me the photograph, I sat with it for a long time, because what I remember about that day is not a clear sequence. It's pressure and sound and my body moving before I'd made a decision. I remember the vehicle burning. I remember the child. What I don't remember is what it looked like from 30 meters away. Looking at the photograph, I can see exactly where I was and what I was doing, and I can see the smoke from the blast still rising behind me, and I can see that the fire was recent and active when I went into the open. And I think that might be the most specific record of who I was on the worst day I have ever had. I didn't know until Whitfield found you that that record existed. I thought it was just my word. I said, it's a photograph. That's all it is. He said, Miss Brooks, I have a 10-year-old daughter named Priya. I haven't held her in 9 months. She understands more than any 10-year-old should have to understand about why her father is not home. That photograph is not just a photograph. I held the phone. The hearing aid produced its quiet background hum. I said, how is she doing? He said, she's extraordinary. She has my stubbornness and her mother's capacity for organization, and the combination makes her formidable. She has a science fair project that she's already on the 3rd draft of. She's gonna be fine. I just need to not be in prison for the next 18 years so I can see how fine she becomes. I said, I'll see you in 11 weeks. He said, yes, you will. And Miss Brooks, thank you for staying out there, for doing the work, for being the kind of person who presses the shutter. The night before my testimony, I was in a hotel room 3 blocks from the courthouse. I had arrived 5 days early because Whitfield wanted to do one more preparation session in person, and because I did not trust myself to arrive the day before testimony without something going wrong with a flight. I had been in the hotel for 4 days. The hotel coffee was adequate. There was a diner 2 blocks away with pie that was better than adequate. I had found a route that took me past a small used bookstore, and I had gone in on the 3rd day and spent an hour and come out with 2 books I didn't need and 1 I did. On the night before my testimony, I called Deb at 9 o'clock. She said, where are you? I said, the hotel, 3 blocks from the courthouse. She said, are you sleeping? I said, adequately. She said, what are you eating? I said, I found a diner. They have pie. She said, good, get the pie. I said, Deb, I've been thinking about what it is, what the work is, what I'm doing when I'm doing it. She said, and I said, I haven't known how to say it to Claire, not in a way that she would actually hear. She said, you've been trying to explain it to someone who made a different choice. You can't explain a choice to someone by describing the choice. You have to show them what the choice was for. I said, the photograph. She said, the photograph, the record. That man's daughter not growing up with a father who's in prison for something he didn't do. That's what the choice was for. That's what staying is for. Not every time, not every photograph, but this time, yes. I said, I want to tell Claire. She said, tell her after. do what you went there to do first. I said, yeah. She said, Angela, you were always there. You were there when you needed to be there. That's all this was. Being there, I said, good night, Deb. She said, good night, eat the pie. The courtroom on the morning of the third day of trial was smaller than courtrooms in film and television tend to suggest. Military courtrooms have their own particular quality, a compressed and specific formality in which every surface and every position is correct and every person present understands their exact place in the structure. I sat in the witness waiting room for 1 hour and 40 minutes before Whitfield came to get me. I drank the waiting room coffee, which was not good. I read approximately 3 pages of one of the books from the used bookstore without absorbing any of it. Whitfield said, "You're up after lunch. The government's morning witness ran longer than projected. How are you?" I said, "Ready." He said, "Is there anything you want to go over?" I said, "No." He said, "Okay." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "I've been practicing law for 22 years. I want to say something that isn't about the case. What you did, showing up here, what you've been doing for 14 years, is not a small thing. When you sit in that chair this afternoon and they push back against the photograph, what you're actually defending is not just the image, you're defending the record. The idea that someone being where you were and doing what you did when you did it means that we know what was true instead of what someone assumed was true. That matters beyond this case. I want you to know I understand that." I said, "I pressed the shutter. That's all." He said, "Miss Brooks, that is everything." I was sworn in at 14 minutes past 1 in the afternoon. The room was quiet with the specific military quiet that is not the absence of tension but the containment of it. Whitfield began with my background, methodical and unhurried, establishing my credentials and my experience and the length and nature of my embed with Charlie Company, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines. He moved through the timeline of October 12th, the staging, the patrol, the detonation, the conditions in the moments before and after. I answered everything precisely and directly. I had gone over it enough times that the delivery was clean without sounding rehearsed. When Whitfield moved to the image itself, he placed an enlarged print of image 143 on a display visible to the judge, the military jury panel, the prosecution, and the defendant. I looked at Marcus Webb as the photograph went up. He was looking at the photograph, and his face did the thing that faces do when they are looking at something that they recognize as the truth of a moment they lived through but couldn't see from where they were standing. I described taking the photograph, the detonation, the shrapnel hit, the knee going down, the shutter pressing, the timestamp at 14:17 and 52 seconds on the camera's internal clock synchronized that morning to my satellite phone, as was my daily protocol. I described the file, the metadata, the chain of custody from the camera card to my laptop to Deb's secure archive to the digital forensics firm retained by the defense. I described the absence of any processing or editing to the original file. The prosecutor was Major Diane Holloway. She was controlled and precise, and she came at the cross-examination from multiple directions, the way a thorough prosecutor does when the evidence is working against her, and she needs to find the angle of attack that creates enough doubt to keep the jury from settling. She challenged the clock synchronization. I presented the documentation of the daily synchronization protocol. She challenged the identification of the individual in the photograph. I noted that the military photo analyst had already confirmed the identification based on identifiable uniform markings and physical profile, and that the defense had those findings in evidence. She challenged the chain of custody, specifically the period between my camera card and the magazine's archive. I walked through the timeline precisely. The direct transfer from the card in the field to my laptop via a wired connection, the same day upload to the magazine's secure server, the folder structure that dated the upload by its creation timestamp. She shifted approach. She said, "Miss Brooks, approximately 90 seconds before you pressed the shutter on this photograph, an improvised explosive device detonated within approximately 40 meters of your position." I said, "That's correct." She said, "And you chose, in that moment, to raise your camera." I said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because that's what I was there to do." She said, "To take photographs of a firefight." I said, To document what was happening, whatever was happening, she said, and at that moment, approximately 90 seconds after a significant blast and during an active engagement, what was happening, from your specific vantage point, was what you've described. A Marine outside his position, carrying a child. I said, yes, that was what was happening. She looked at me. She held the silence for a moment the way experienced attorneys do when they're deciding whether the silence itself is an advantage. Then she said, no further questions. Whitfield did not redirect. He did not need to. I sat in the hallway after my testimony and I thought about the Sarah Pallotta postcard. I thought about the man on the ladder, looking into the camera, existing in exactly the place and the moment he was in. I thought about Deb's handwriting on the back of it, tilting forward as if it was in a hurry, saying, this is why you go. The pivotal moment of the trial came the following morning. On the fourth day, after the defense had presented 2 additional witnesses, the prosecution asked to recall Lance Corporal Trent Ballard for a brief supplemental examination. The request was unusual, and Whitfield indicated later that he had been uncertain about the prosecution's intention, whether they were trying to shore up Ballard's credibility or whether Ballard himself had requested the recall. Either way, the judge permitted it. Ballard took the stand on the morning of the 4th day. He was 24 years old. He had the look of someone who had been trying very hard for a long time to hold something in a particular shape and who was beginning to understand that the shape was not holding. Major Holloway asked him 2 brief questions to reestablish his account and then sat down. Whitfield approached for cross-examination. He brought the enlarged print of image 143 and placed it where Ballard could see it clearly. He asked Ballard to look at it. Ballard looked at it. Whitfield said, Lance Corporal Ballard, you've had the opportunity to review the defense's evidence regarding this photograph, including the timestamp analysis. Based on that analysis, this image was captured at 14, 17, and 52 seconds on October 12, 2019. Ballard said, yes, sir. Whitfield said, and in your preliminary hearing testimony, you stated that you observed the defendant moving away from his assigned position at approximately 14:15. Ballard said, that was my recollection at the time. Whitfield said, approximately 2 minutes before this photograph was taken. Ballard said, yes, sir. Whitfield said, does this photograph change anything about your recollection of what you observed at approximately 14:15? The silence that followed was not long in absolute terms. 4 seconds, perhaps 5. But it was the kind of silence that changes the oxygen in a room. Ballard said, I want to. He stopped. He said, what I saw on October 12th was the worst thing I have ever seen. I had Marines down. He stopped again. He pressed his hands flat on the rail in front of him. He said, what I saw at approximately 14:15 was movement. I saw movement away from the line, and I assumed I was in the middle of something that I was not prepared for, that nobody is prepared for regardless of training. And I saw movement, and I assumed the movement was Sergeant Webb leaving his post. I assumed it because I was terrified and because the assumption made sense of what I was seeing and because I needed the chaos to have a cause that I could identify. I testified to that assumption as if it was a fact. And sitting here now, looking at this photograph, looking at what Sergeant Webb was doing at 14:17 and 52 seconds, 2 minutes after what I testified, I do not know that what I saw at 14:15 was Sergeant Webb. I know I saw movement. I don't know anymore that it was him. And I should have said that before. I should have said I believed I saw him moving, not that I saw him. I'm sorry. I know what my testimony has cost him. I'm sorry. The room was very still. The prosecution did not redirect. The remainder of the trial took 4 more days. I am not the right person to reconstruct the legal proceedings, and I won't try. What I can tell you is that on a Thursday afternoon at 3:42, the military jury panel returned with their findings, and the findings on all charges were not guilty. I was in the hallway outside the courtroom. Whitfield came out first, and he walked toward me, and he said, "It's done." I said, "Okay." He said, "Marcus is with his family. He said he wants to see you." Webb came out of the courtroom about 10 minutes later. He was with his wife, who I had not met, and with a woman I took to be his mother. His wife was holding his arm with both of hers. His mother was holding his hand. He saw me across the hallway and he came toward me and he stopped at about 3 feet and he said, "Miss Brooks?" I said, "Sergeant Webb." He said, "I don't have the right words for this." I said, "You don't need to find them." He said, "Priya is going to know your name for the rest of her life. I want you to know that." I thought about the scar on my left forearm. I thought about the hearing aid in my left ear. I thought about the shutter pressing before the conscious decision to press it. I said, "Tell her hello from me." He said, "I will." His mother put her hand on my shoulder, briefly, without saying anything. Some gestures don't need language. I flew home 2 days later. I was in the airport for the standard amount of time that airports require, which is always longer than seems necessary, and I sat in a chair near a gate with poor light and I drank airport coffee, which was worse than the cheap kind I bought for myself, which Deb considered a moral failing and which I considered a calibration of expectation, and I thought about the phone call I needed to make. I called Claire from the gate. She answered on the third ring. She said, "You're at the airport." I said, "Boarding in about 20 minutes. She said, "How did it go?" I said, "Not guilty. On all charges. He's going home." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Angela, that's because of your photograph." I said, "Yes." She said, She stopped. I said, "Claire, I need to say something." She said, "Okay." I said, "I've been thinking about what you said in your kitchen, the part I hadn't heard before, about what I've been hiding from." She waited. I said, "I haven't been hiding. I know you've believed that for a long time, and I understand why it looks that way from where you're standing. But I want to tell you what it actually is, because I should have told you a long time ago, and I didn't, and that's on me." She said, "Okay." I said, "When I raise that camera, I'm not putting distance between myself and what's happening. I'm doing the opposite. I'm going as close as I'm able to go, and I'm staying there when everything in my body says to leave, and I'm pressing the shutter, and I'm saying, this happened, this person was here, this moment was real." And sometimes that record is the only thing that can tell the truth about a moment after the moment is over and the memories have shifted toward what people needed to believe was true. The camera doesn't drift the way memory drifts. The camera holds the moment as it was, and I was there to hold it. Claire was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, she said, "I didn't know. I thought. I thought you were going away from things. I thought the camera was how you went away from things. I didn't think about it being the other way around." I said, "I know. I should have explained it better. I probably should have explained it years ago." She said, "You tried to explain it." I said, "I tried. I don't know if I tried hard enough." She said, "I'm sorry for the things I said. I've said versions of it for 20 years, and I'm sorry." I said, "I know." She said, "Is the coffee terrible there?" I said, "It is genuinely terrible. The worst I have had in recent memory, including several conflict zones." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. She said, "Come for dinner on Sunday. I'll make the pasta thing." I said, "Okay." She said, "Angela, I'm proud of you. I should have said that a long time ago. I'm proud of the work you do, and I'm proud of you." I held the phone against my right ear. The gate had started boarding. Through the window, the light on the tarmac was doing nothing remarkable. Afternoon airport light, flat and functional. I thought about the man on the ladder looking into the camera. I thought about Deb's handwriting on the back of the postcard. I thought about a shutter pressing at 14:17 and 52 seconds on October 12th in 2009. I said, "I'll see you Sunday." I hung up and I got on the plane. Deb left a voicemail while I was in the air. When I landed and retrieved it, it was 4 words. She said, "You were always there." 3 months after the acquittal, I received an email through the contact form on my professional website. The sender identified herself as Priya Webb, age 10, 5th grade, currently working on a science fair project about photographic evidence and factual accuracy. She wrote that she was investigating how photographs can be more reliable records of events than human eyewitness testimony because photographs don't experience stress or fear or the need to make sense of things the way that people do. She wanted to know if she could use image 143 as part of her presentation. She said her project was called The Camera Remembers What People Forget. I wrote back immediately and said yes. I said I would send her a high-resolution print suitable for display. I asked her to let me know how her project went. 6 weeks later, she emailed me a photograph that her teacher had taken. She was standing in front of her display board with a blue ribbon in her hands, held in front of her with both arms, and she was grinning in the specific way that belongs entirely to a 10-year-old who has just won something significant and who has not yet learned to make her joy smaller so that other people are comfortable. She had her father's jaw and her mother's eyes. Behind her, on the display board, was image 143, enlarged, mounted, captioned, doing the work it was made to do. I printed the photograph of Priya and her ribbon. I put it on the wall next to the Sarah Pilata postcard. Marcus Webb received an honorable discharge from the United States Marine Corps the following year. He returned to Macon, Georgia. He teaches history at a high school there. He coaches the school's junior varsity basketball team in the winter. He still carries the photograph of Priya in a plastic sleeve in his left breast pocket. The photograph has been replaced with a new one. In the new one, she is 12 years old and standing in front of a trophy case. I went back to work. I am still going back to work. There will be other embeds and other assignments and other mornings in staging areas and other moments when the shutter presses before the conscious mind has issued the instruction. There will be other photographs that sit in archives for years before anyone understands what they were holding. There will be other Debs and other postcards and other nights in other hotels with bad coffee and the specific quiet of waiting for the next thing that needs to be documented. Claire came to an exhibition of my work last spring, a mid-career retrospective at a gallery downtown. 20 images selected by me and Deb from 14 years of work. Claire came on the opening evening with her husband and her daughter Jessie, who is now 17 and doing competitive debate and who looked at every image with the kind of focused attention that people who are serious about argument develop for evidence. Claire walked through the exhibition slowly. She didn't say anything for most of it. When she got to image 143, which was the last image in the sequence and the largest print in the show, she stood in front of it for a long time. She didn't say anything. She took my arm with both of hers and she stood there and she looked at it. And I stood there beside her and I let her. There is a specific kind of seeing that happens when you look at a photograph of something true. It is not the same as looking at the thing itself. It is not better or worse. It is different. It has the quality of stillness that the moment itself never had. Because moments don't hold still. Moments are pressure and sound and the body making decisions before the mind catches up. The photograph holds what the moment couldn't hold itself. It says, here is what was there. Here is what was happening. Here is the person who was in the open, in the fire, carrying the child when everything else was chaos. My name is Angela Brooks. I am 42 years old. I pressed a shutter on October 12th, 2019. And the thing I pressed it toward turned out to be the truest record of what a man had done on the worst day of his life. My sister told me I had spent my whole adult life hiding behind a camera. The camera turned out to be the only thing that had been standing still in the fire. The witness you carry back from the places where things happen is not always welcome and not always needed and not always understood until years have passed and the memories have drifted and what someone assumed as being treated as what was true. But the photograph does not drift. The photograph holds. And when the moment comes that the holding matters, the photograph is there. It was always there. It will always be there. That is why you go. That is why you stay. That is why you press the shutter.